Hello, and welcome to the most international episode of Slate Money that I think we have ever recorded. I am Felix Salmon of Axios. I am at Seaplane Armada in Brooklyn. I am joined by Emily Peck of Axios, who's at home in Westchester.
Hello, from Westchester.
We are most excited because guess who's back on the show, folks? But the one and only AnnaSzymanski.
Thank you. Hello. I am coming to you from London.
You're in London, and somehow it's part of this great life change. And we're going to talk more in the Slate Plus about your great life changes. But as part of this great life change of moving to London, you also made a great life change of being able to be on Slate Money again.
Yes, I am back in the world of financial journalism. I am back at Reuters, so I can now, when you want me back, be on Slate Money.
Yay!
So exciting. And just to make things even more international, we also have the one and only Henry Grabar. Henry, welcome back.
Good to be here. Thanks, Felix.
Henry, for those of us who maybe don't recall the wonderful episode we did with your parking book, who are you? And also, where are you?
Well, Felix, I'm a staff writer at Slate. I am the author, most recently, of Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World. And I am coming to you from the basement of the Paris Media Center for international journalists covering the Olympic Games, but who do not have real press passes to go to the Olympic Games themselves.
So you live in Paris now. You're coming to us from Paris. This is obviously going to be an Olympics show. We're going to talk about the Paris Olympics. We're going to talk about the scaffolding in the Paris Olympics. We are going to talk about the infrastructure of the Olympics and also the infrastructure of America in terms of passenger rail. We are going to talk about the massive economic news that came out on Friday with the jobs report and what that means for interest rates in the United States. We're going to talk about interest rates in Japan. We're going to talk about the price of soup dumplings in Taiwan. This is all over the globe. It's going to be an awesome show, and it's all coming up on Slate Money.
Isn't the point of traveling to get away from it all? To feel the best you've ever felt? Then maybe you should check out Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool, white, sandy beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll meet locals brimming with gratitude for an island that redefines what a paradise can be. When your trip comes to an end, you won't need another vacation because you just had the vacation. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
Today's episode is supported by What Should I Do With My Money? An original podcast from Morgan Stanley. Smart people often don't feel smart about money. Find What Should I Do With My Money on your favorite podcast player to hear from people just like you getting help from experienced financial advisors.
Okay, let's start with the economy because in the immortal words of Emily Peck, it is imploding. This is what Emily says. We had a jobs report on Friday, which was, I think the word is terrible. There were not very many jobs created and unemployment spiked up. And even though the Fed did not cut interest rates this past week, everyone now kind of expects that they're going to do a monster half-point cut in September. And Anna, what is going on? And most importantly for me, why is Japan going in the other direction?
Okay, so, well, number one, I would say that some of the adjectives and nouns that were just used, I might take issue with in terms of, I don't know if I would necessarily call it implosion. I don't know if I would call 50 basis points a monster cut. So having said all of that, I will say that, okay, so what's happening? Well, what we're seeing today is that the market was priced for a environment in which interest rates would slowly start to come down, but the economy would still stay relatively strong. And then what we saw today with the jobs report was people starting to say like, oh, wait, the economy may actually be weaker than we had anticipated, weaker than we had originally priced in. So number one, that means you've seen significant movements in the bond market. You've seen significant declines in treasury yields because people are now pricing in more Fed cuts through the end of the year. And you're also seeing weakness in equities because they were priced for an economy that now we think we may not have. They are being priced for a stronger economy than it appears that we actually have. So that's what you're seeing. Now, what I think has mattered a little bit more than just one day's market move is what has been happening with central banks this week. And honestly, for a number of months in terms of the way that the tone and direction of central banks has been shifting. So what we saw this week were central banks moving in seemingly and sometimes actual different directions. So we had the Bank of Japan, which actually increased interest rates modestly. We had the Bank of England, which cut rates. And then we had the Fed, which held steady. However, the press conference suggested that they will almost certainly be cutting interest rates in the September meeting. So why are we seeing some of these differences among central banks? Partly it's because the number one concern for the BOJ is the strength of the yen. So the yen has been extremely weak. And while that has maybe been good for some large exporters, it has been negative for a lot of Japan, where you import quite a bit. That's the main reason why you're having the Bank of Japan act in that way, because the concern is that if import costs continue to be high, if imports continue to be expensive, that could pass through to inflation. It can also actually weigh on consumption because everything's expensive.
Let me just stop you there, because you are a markets professional and you understand these things, and we are just normal folks and we don't. So the first thing is, the Bank of Japan, is it worried that that inflation is too high? Because I feel like for the past 8 million years, the Bank of Japan has been worried that inflation is too low. Has that now flipped? And they're like, oh, if we have a weak yen and there's lots of increasingly expensive imports, that's going to make inflation too high. That's like so weird for Japan to me.
It is very weird for Japan. And yes, I mean, inflation currently is higher than target in Japan. And there is that concern that if imports stay high, then that could increase even more. So while, yes, Japan has historically been much more concerned about deflation than inflation, that environment seems to have shifted. And as you point out, that actually is significant.
Right. So congratulations to the Bank of Japan and the weak yen for finally doing what they've been trying to do for the past 20 years, which is get some inflation in the country. Big tick. That's a win. And now they're actually, they might have overshot a bit, or they're worried that they might overshoot a bit. So they're tightening a bit. They actually have like positive interest rates. Wow. It's all good, like a normal. It feels like slightly more of a more normal economy. But then the other thing I wanted to ask you about Japan is, explain this currency dynamic. Is the idea here that if you raise interest rates, then people will buy yen to get the massive 0.2% interest they get on yen, and so therefore the yen will appreciate?
It's just all relative, that because you had the rest of developed markets keeping rates very high while you had the yen very low, that made the yen depreciate. Just
like slow this down for normal people. How does that make the yen depreciate?
Because it's less attractive to hold. If I can get 5% somewhere versus getting 0%, I probably want to get 5%.
So what I do is I sell my yen and use the proceeds to buy dollars, basically, the sort of carry trade. And that constant pressure of people selling the yen and buying dollars because the dollars yield more is pushing the yen down.
Yeah, so there are other mechanisms as well, but yes, I mean, I think that is the interest rate differential has certainly been a major factor in putting massive pressure on the yen over the last few years.
Basically, since interest rates became significantly positive in the US and other countries, there wasn't much of a differential when rates were zero everywhere, but then when rates were 5% in America and zero in Japan, then you had that big differential and that really hurt the yen. Is that basically it?
Correct.
So now we're expecting rate cuts in the US, and we've had this little baby rate hike in Japan. But it strikes me that the differential is still pretty big on an absolute basis. And even a little hike in Japan, and even a relatively big cut in the United States, is not going to change the big picture, which is the US interest rates are going to be much higher than Japanese interest rates for the foreseeable future.
But it's all relative. And you also have to factor in other FX dynamics. But in a simple way, you can say that, number one, it's a signaling mechanism. It signals that the Bank of Japan is moving in towards a more normal environment. And the Bank of Japan has also indicated that this is not going to be the last hike. So number one, it's not just about this hike itself, it's what it indicates. And then on top of that, when you're dealing in markets, small moves can make a really big difference. Nobody's expecting that the yen is going to massively appreciate, but it is, as we've already seen, it is definitely going to strengthen. So the issue is relative. It's relative to where you were positioned before and where you thought that the yen was going to be before. Now you think that's going to be different. That's going to shift positioning.
And then coming back to the United States, we've had like a really big move in bond yields in the past couple of months, basically. The 10-year bond, which was yielding sort of 4.5%, is now yielding 3.75%, something like that. That's like a 75 basis point drop in the most important interest rate in the country, which is not the Fed funds rate. It's not the overnight rate. It's how much it costs you to borrow and invest for the long term. It's the 10-year rate that mortgages are priced off. And so that large decrease in bond yields, is that just in and of itself going to help stimulate the economy before the Fed even acts?
Well, first, I would say that actually we've seen yields moving all over the place this year. At the beginning of the year, people were pricing in 6, 7 interest rate cuts, and then those expectations shifted significantly, and now they're pricing in more cuts again. So actually this whole year, there's been yields have been moving around all over the place. But going back to your actual question about how much this is going to stimulate the economy, one rate cut is not going to stimulate the economy. The issue is, does this indicate that the Fed is going to continue cutting rates significantly moving forward? Now, I think the Fed has indicated, and markets are certainly assuming, that there isn't just going to be one cut, that there are going to be cuts potentially at many of the next number of meetings. And I actually think what you're pointing to is very important, because I think people have a tendency to focus on each cut. And especially when you're talking about the first cut in a potentially cutting cycle, that can be important. But ultimately, what matters is where interest rates land. Whether there's a cut this month or whether there's a cut the next month, like that, at the end of the day, that's actually not that significant. But we've been in an interest rate environment for the last few years that has been massively different from what people were used to in the previous decade. So the question then becomes, are we going back towards something that people were used to in the last decade, or are interest rates going to remain in a more elevated, but frankly, more normal environment?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. We've seen for the past 4 years an expectation on everyone's part in all parts of the economy of somehow going back to normal or back to what we were used to. And time and again, that isn't actually what happens. So you would sort of expect the same to be true, once the Fed starts cutting rates. It's not like we're going to go back to ZIRP world. It does seem like we're in a really new era for the economy. I mean, I remember talking to Anna and Felix in 2019, and the big problem was like, where is the inflation? Will we ever be at target or near target? Like, can we ever raise interest rates again? Like, that was the hand wringing and the talk of the time. And now, all it took, that was the hand wringing and the talk of the time. And now, all it took, policymakers didn't realize all you needed to do to get out of that zone was to have a global pandemic, record unemployment, and some big volatile changes, war in Ukraine, whatever. And then you get inflation and you get the ability to raise rates. So I feel like we're in a new phase. There's no going back, but clearly something is changing. I don't know if it's a return to normalcy necessarily, but it's a move into something else. The labor market, pretty clearly, there are signs. There was a weak jobs report on Friday. It's getting weaker. There have been other indicators showing the same thing. The strong economy we've had for a while that we've used to counter all the negative vibe talk isn't really here anymore, it's starting to look like. So, it's a new era. That's what I would say.
I do think you're right that there's a big sort of return to normal trade here. That 10-year bond yield at 3.8% or whatever it is, that feels kind of normal. The Bank of Japan is moving out of its crazy zero negative interest rate world and towards normal. The Bank of England, is kind of sniping and it can't decide what to do and it's struggling a bit, but it's England is a mess. And so now it's just like a normal English mess, which we're kind of used to. And we can go back, frankly, to normal economic cycles where maybe, you have strong economic growth for a while and then you have like a small recession and then you go back to economic growth for a while. And that's normal. And we shouldn't be terrified of a recession because the past 2 recessions were so absolutely terrifying. Most recessions are not terrifying. Most recessions are kind of normal. And maybe this is just, we're kind of inching our way to a post-pandemic kind of normalcy, if that makes sense.
I think you're both right. I think there are many indicators that would suggest that. The one thing I do think it's important to remember, though, is that we had 10 years of rates being essentially at or near zero. And that means that a lot of companies, a lot of countries made policy decisions based on the expectation that rates were going to stay near zero forever. And if that is not the case, and we end up landing somewhere closer to between 2 and 4, as opposed to 0 and 2 on the Fed funds rate, that's a massively different world. And I think that you could potentially have a lot more pain that happens among companies that right now are kind of like finding ways to kick the can down the road, doing things, wishing and hoping, crossing their fingers and toes that everything goes back to normal. Because if they don't, their capital structures don't make any sense. So I agree with you that I think we are probably moving back towards a more normal, and I would maybe even argue a healthier market environment. But I think we may still have some significant pain along the way.
Slate Money is sponsored this week by Shopify. And if you are selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business, from launching your online shop to having a real-life store to selling millions of widgets, whatever it is you're selling, soap or outdoor outfits. Shopify will help you sell everywhere. They have an all-in-one e-commerce platform. They have an in-person point-of-sale system. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify has got you covered. Get this, Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. They have something called Shopify Magic, which is an AI-powered all-star. They have award-winning help to help support your success every step of the way, because businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/money, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/money now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/money.
Today's episode is supported by What Should I Do With My Money? An original podcast from Morgan Stanley. Smart people often don't feel smart about money. Find What Should I Do With My Money on your favorite podcast player to hear from people just like you getting help from experienced financial advisors. Can we talk about something fun now and heartwarming and inspiring?
Yeah, Henry Grabar, welcome from Paris. You are sitting in a podcasting studio in a basement of a media center in which arrondissement are you in?
I'm in the 3rd arrondissement, so pretty close to the Place de la République, for those of you who know Paris. And it's really an extraordinarily beautiful building that the city of Paris has set up for foreign journalists. And I should be specific here. There's 2 types of journalists at the Olympic Games. There are the ones who apply for IOC press credentials, which has to be done more than a year in advance. And those are the people who get to walk in and sit wherever they want in the badminton arena or the rugby finals or whatever. And then there are the lowly journalists like myself who applied mere months in advance. And we don't get to go to any of the competition venues of the Olympic Village, but we do get access to this beautiful media center that the city of Paris has organized for us.
From what I've been reading, which is 100% your articles in Slate, this is the kind of tread softly on the ground Olympics where things like the media center or the badminton or the rugby or whatever, they just kind of fold them into the warp and weft of Paris, and they'll have lots of sporting going on for a few weeks, and then they'll unfold everything and it'll go back to normal. It's the exact opposite of, sort of like the China style, we're going to build massive stadiums and venues and all the rest of it. It's just like, we are going to sort of transform Paris for a few weeks and then we're going to untransform it. And then you almost won't realize that there was ever an Olympics here at all.
Yeah, that's very much been their pitch from the beginning. I think a little history here after Athens, mostly, but also sort of as a result of a series of Olympics, there's been this realization on the part of the IOC that they're leaving host cities with an untenable amount of debt and all these buildings that nobody has any use for. And so they sort of revised what they were looking for, and they said, you know what, we would permit someplace to do something more temporary, lighter touch, more sustainable, all that jazz. And that was very much the thrust of Paris's bid to host the Olympics. And we're seeing that in practice now. I think it cuts both ways. On the one hand, you have a lot of temporary venues which have been constructed relatively cheaply compared to permanent stuff. That's also enabled them to put all these venues really in the heart of the city, often right smack dab in the middle of some very famous public spaces, including in the court at Versailles, in front of the Eiffel Tower, and so on. And I guess the other half of that is that it has been quite present in the city, right? I mean, when you have a series of road races and triathlons going right down the main boulevards, it does prove to be pretty disruptive for people who are trying to get from one side of town to the other. And especially that was the case during the opening ceremony, which ran all the way down the Seine, of course.
And the triathlon, just to be clear, they're swimming in the Seine, right?
Yeah, I watched them dive into the Seine. I mean, that was kind of the flagship promise of these Olympics, was they were going to make the Seine clean enough for people to swim in. And then...
Did they, though?
I know. Usually the summer in Paris is very hot and dry, and the pollution in the Seine comes from combined sewer overflow, which happens when it rains. Now, Paris has just had the rainiest winter and spring on record, period. So not a fortuitous turn of events for a clean Seine, and they basically decided that it was good enough, but was it very good? We don't really know, because they haven't been very forthcoming with the data all of a sudden about how clean the river is.
Oh, so gross. Didn't one Olympian say it tasted bad or something? Something bad.
Yes. I mean, would it taste good even if it were under the acceptable E. coli limit?
Fair question.
Great question.
Sure.
I'm fascinated by this logistics stuff, both in the run-up to the Olympics and now that they're going on. If you're just like a normal Parisian, well, if you're a normal Parisian, it's August, you're not even in Paris. But if you're like one of the Parisians who didn't leave Paris for the month of August, like in order to get around town, do I need to be showing QR codes everywhere I go? Do I need a special dispensation to be a Paris resident?
I would say if you're on foot or on a bicycle right now, you can pretty much go wherever you want, with the understanding that every so often you'll come to a street or a bridge with a bunch of police on it, and they'll just say, nope, can't go this way, and you'll have to figure something else out. And that means that, the Olympic medal in speed walking is about to be determined or whatever, right? So that does happen. It mostly happens on the western half of the city around the big monuments, right? Which is not where most working class Parisians live. So the extent to which this is disrupting people's normal lives is a little hard to discern. I think the people who are most upset are those who work in the hospitality industry, especially restaurants. But generally speaking, things have improved significantly from the opening ceremony. I mean, that, which actually has nothing to do with the games themselves, it's just a pure theatrical spectacle, as you saw, that was incredibly disruptive and difficult and required what Le Monde called the greatest security mobilization in peacetime history of France to pull that off. So that week before the opening ceremony was extremely difficult. QR codes were needed to access a lot of the city's core neighborhoods.
But now, and I feel like this is the case with a lot of things. I think, was it the World Cup that was in Qatar a few years ago? I think. And in the run-up, all the coverage was like, laborers are dying in the heat and it's terrible and this is all awful. And then the game starts and everyone's like, whee, soccer, football.
That was the London Olympics too. Like I feel like every single Olympics is like the locals always grumble and they moan and they're like, I don't want the Olympics. Who thought this was a good idea?
Terrible.
This is going to be terrible. It's going to be horrible. And then it happens and then they're like, oh my God, this is
so
great.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that exactly what has happened in France?
It's following that script to a T. I guess It helps that France has won a bunch of medals. So in addition to feeling proud of their country and how good it looks on television, they are also proud of their athletes. They were second in the gold medal count until today, and now I think they're third behind the US and China. So everyone's feeling good about that. And the other thing that's happened, and this is interesting, Le Monde reported the other day that 87% of attendees at the Olympics are French. Which attendees are being counted in that statistic, I'm not sure if that's just ticket holders or that includes people who
French ones
see a race go by or something. But it just goes to show that this is something that has actually been wholeheartedly embraced by, however you define it, the locals, the hosts. They may not be Parisians, but it's definitely true that France is like kind of Olympics crazy right now in a good way.
And tell me about the hospitality industry, because this is one angle which I was really fascinated by. You said the restaurateurs are kind of upset. But broadly speaking, presumably all of the hotels have jacked up their rates to eye-watering levels, and people can Airbnb out their apartments for crazy amounts of money. But there was also this thing like immediately before the Olympics, like all Paris was basically empty and the hotels were empty.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how bad the week before the Olympics started was. That was when they were preparing the opening ceremony, and the entire Seine was closed. All but 4 bridges were closed over the river in the center of Paris. It was like the city was divided in two for 7 straight days. And if you were in the zone, it meant that, sometimes people couldn't access your business at all. Sometimes it meant people were sitting at your restaurant behind chain link fences. I think more broadly speaking, the hospitality industry has been through a kind of cycle of first avarice and optimism, thinking that they could just add another zero onto every bill. Then reality check, that's not going to work. And demand for the Olympics is not infinite. And in fact, as happened in London in 2012, many regular tourists, of which Paris obviously has lots and lots, just don't come. And so to some extent, it's just a pure substitution of your regular summer traffic with a different type of tourist. These days, Airbnb bookings are up. Hotel occupancy is about normal for this time of year, although the hotels say that the prices actually wound up being lower than they would be in a typical summer. And the restaurants almost uniformly say that it's been really tough and they've had way fewer customers than expected. The one place where I think the jury is out is on shops. I suspect that the type of people who bring their kids to see the U.S. beach volleyball team are not the same people who go and drop $2,000 at a French department store or even at some, made in France boutique in the Marais. So I think that the economic effects of this are going to be pretty mixed, as they always are with these types of events. There's all this talk about how much secondary spending there's going to be, and those numbers rarely materialize, and I suspect this will be no exception.
One thing I do think is interesting, if you're looking at a city like Paris, where it's different maybe from what we often think of, where Olympics, or at least historically, the Olympics were often in smaller cities that maybe needed the press, needed to be on television, needed the tourist bump. But like Paris tends to get tourists in the summer. So I guess that's interesting in terms of what that economic impact is going to be there.
Yeah, why did Paris want the Olympics?
That question still puzzles me a little bit, even as fun as it is. I mean, I sort of think they just wanted to do it because they could. They were like, we have this vision of this kind of distributed low-cost Olympics, and we think we can do it, and we want to try that. I think they would probably say that there's no cost to them of doing the Olympics. Emmanuel Macron has said the games pay for the games. Now, that depends on a lot of budgeting wizardry, but there's basically 2 sections of the Olympic budget. One is operations, and it's true that the operations side of the games is mostly privately financed, and that private money expects to basically break even on those investments. And that's stuff like ticket sales and sponsorships are paying for the staffing of these temporary venues and their construction and all that. Now, there's another half of the budget, which is $4.5 billion, which is for the permanent stuff. And that means like, the aquatic center in Saint-Denis and the new stadium at Porte-la-Chapelle, which is being used for badminton. There's been a variety of permanent investments, mostly in Saint-Denis, which is the poor department to the north of Paris. And I think the government would say, those are investments that we wanted to make anyway. This gave us an excuse to do things that we wanted to do. And so we don't really think of that as, us taking a hit on doing this stuff. If anything, everybody here will say the Olympics provided the catalyst to get these projects done in time. Now, I think that's true to some extent, that, the extension of the Line 14, which is the automated metro line that now runs all the way north and all the way south to the airport, that probably wouldn't have opened in June if there wasn't a major international sports competition in July. So I think that's correct. I still think to some extent there's, some of these investments in various sporting facilities probably wouldn't have been the choices you would have made if you were thinking about what this area of the country needs most.
Wait, are we going to talk about Henry's piece on how Google Maps has messed with people during the Olympics, and they send you?
Oh my God, this is so awesome. This is just this is Cass Sunstein nudge taken to its way past its logical conclusion. So explain what is going on here.
Yeah, so basically the company that runs public transportation in the Paris region developed maybe a year or two ago a model of what they thought traffic was going to look like on the buses, trains, and subways during the Olympics, based on where the venues were, how many people were going to be there, et cetera. Because the big concern going into these games, terrorism, obviously, but really among Parisians, I think, was the idea that the city was just going to cease to function because they felt the trains are already so crowded. How can we expect all these Olympic visitors to just pile onto the train with everybody else? And to the extent that the Olympics so far have basically worked, I think it's in part because the Parisians have left town, but it's also because this regional transportation organization fed this model to all the navigation apps like Google Maps, Apple Maps, City Mapper, and so on, which has in turn directed everyone in Paris to take routes that are actually not the most direct routes, but help balance out the traffic on the system. So it is sort of the route that's best for society, although not maybe best for you.
That is so crazy to me. I just want to open Google Maps and trust they're giving me the best route for me. Tell me what the traffic is and I can make my own decision. But I don't know about this socialist mapping situation.
I think this is wonderful. Because if it's almost like another form of surge pricing, but you're paying in time and exercise as opposed to money. Because if they increased prices in the area that, the route that's most traveled, everyone would lose their minds if they had to pay more. But if you have to walk more, then you don't really notice it.
But what if Henry had the 80-year-old woman example. What if you're an 80-year-old woman? You don't want to walk 15 minutes out of your way. You're old.
I think where I've come down on this is that the Google option of automatically prescribing you the longer route for the good of society is not good. The City Mapper option, where they offer you that one first and then they tell you the more direct one afterwards, is better. I think ultimately where I come down is I don't like the apps not telling you the fastest way. But I've come to think of it as a kind of reward for local knowledge. It's basically just a kind of tourist tax, but it's taken in time rather than in dollars. And it's saying, if you're a tourist, you are going to have to spend 12 extra minutes making this trip because the Parisians and the people who work here will know that this trip is better done this way.
This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI won't help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, and automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations, so you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI won't help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, and automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
The land down under has never been easier to reach. United Airlines has more flights between the U.S. and Australia than any other U.S. airline, so you can fly nonstop to destinations like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Explore dazzling cities, savor the very best of Aussie cuisine, and get up close and personal with the wildlife. Who doesn't want to hold a koala? Go to united.com/Australia to book your adventure.
I want to stay on the infrastructure thing, though, but move back here to the United States and ask you about trains, because you have this thesis, which I am fascinated by, that after lots of jawboning and talk and visioning and all the rest of it, there is actually movement afoot to have actual new train lines, passenger train lines in America. And indeed, we have one now in Florida called Brightline, which is up and running and moving passengers. And we can talk about whether it's killing a bunch of Floridians. But has something changed in America? Like, there's this one in Texas, there's this one in California. Like, what happened?
It's a good question. I think, well, one thing is, I think there has long been a kind of bipartisan consensus, maybe not politically, but among Americans, that it would be good to be able to ride the train from one place to another, all right? We've been unable to execute on that vision, but the fact that, a private company in Florida has come in and basically turned the nightmarish I-95 trip from South Florida to Central Florida into a train ride that they can get lots and lots of people to pay for shows that, there's a lot of latent demand for this kind of travel between these big parametro areas where currently people are driving, getting stuck in traffic, or paying lots of money for flights. So I don't think there's any question that there's demand there. As far as how to do it goes, obviously, that's very difficult. And I think it's actually even difficult to generalize about the different things that are happening. There's a couple of private sector initiatives, of which this Florida train line, Brightline, is one of them. But then there's also this renewed Amtrak vision, where Amtrak has said, we want to double our ridership in the next 20 years. And we're going to do that by opening a bunch of new routes and upgrading a bunch of track and all this stuff.
And your big idea is that all of this needs to be coordinated, and no one is coordinating it.
Well, I wouldn't say I have any big ideas about this, besides that, it would be nice as a Bostonian to be able to ride the train home to New York and have confidence that it will arrive, which was not the case the last time I did it.
What?
Yeah, because, I don't know if you've been on the train this summer, but the whole Northeast corridor has been fried by the heat. I mean, nothing works. And I think they had like 7 or 10 days when you just couldn't count on getting anywhere between Philadelphia and New Haven. And our train got stuck in Queens and had to be towed by a diesel engine into Penn Station. So I have a personal interest in this.
Is it any worse than flying?
Yes, it was worse than flying.
Well, and I think this is often the issue with train travel in the U.S. is that the way to make it better is for there to be more people traveling by train. But the problem is that when you travel by train, you end up running into these situations where the train doesn't show up, or some freight train has to come by and you have to sit there for 25 minutes, or the train, is dirty. And so I think, and I say this as someone who's actually taken quite a few trains in the United States because I don't drive. So I think it's challenging. And as you say, I think the private investment probably makes sense. I don't know if there's anything from a lot of the Biden infrastructure plans, if that's also supporting some of this, but I feel like it's tricky because you have to get over that difficult period before you're really going to get the increase in ridership.
Yeah, I mean, I think to get at what Felix was talking about, a national plan, there's this new report out from the transit costs folks at NYU. The Transit Cost Project was started by a bunch of people who noticed that the United States spends more money than any of our peer nations in building mass transit infrastructure. The Second Avenue subway in New York, you might know, the most expensive mile of train track ever built in the history of the world. California high-speed rail project, a boondoggle on a massive scale. So clearly we have problems, and they just did this interesting report about why we have problems and what we could do to make this situation better. And one of their conclusions is high-speed rail, as an American priority, needs to have direction from Washington. There needs to be somebody who's in charge of this project and who can coordinate. And one of the examples they give is all these projects that are currently happening, Brightline in Florida, the Northeast Corridor, the Texas Central Project, they should all be buying the same equipment. Because if one day this network expands and these trains join, it would be nice to be able to take a train from Miami to Houston, right? Or from New York to Chicago. But that's not going to happen if all these things develop with their own types of electrical systems, right? And the other advantage of them all investing in the same equipment is that it would create enough demand to sort of get a local American industry off the ground manufacturing these pieces, which doesn't happen when everybody's buying 10 different things. So that's just a small example of why it would be good to have somebody on the federal side saying, we want you to build high-speed rail. Here's how it's going to work. Here's what we want you to do. Here are the specifications, and here are the routes we want to prioritize.
Please tell me at the very least that we have like the same gauge everywhere in America.
Well, currently we do, but we didn't always. Even the New York City subway system doesn't have the same gauge, right? I mean, the numbered trains on the New York City subway system and the lettered trains are different widths.
Yes, they are.
And they can't join. So that does pose a limitation. In American history, this actually plays an important role in American history because, as I learned from reading the Transit Cost Project report, the South, after the Civil War, had a different gauge of railroad than the North. And they realized that if they were going to hitch themselves to this more powerful Northern economy, they were going to have to adjust all their train tracks and change how wide apart they were. And so they did that with hundreds and hundreds of miles of train tracks.
One of the things that this makes me think of is obviously the highway project, the kind of Eisenhower. It seems like if you're looking back towards something where the federal government was able to step in and actually do this type of thing. The thing, though, is that was at a very somewhat unique period in American history where there was perhaps less rancor between parties. I think the reality is just throughout essentially all of American history, with very few exceptions, we functioned often more as a collection of states than we have as this real unified country. And then that just creates all of these problems. And so there are all of these wonderful policies that would work so well if Americans stopped being Americans. But the problem is that they don't. And so then the policies end up failing.
We just need a nationwide Olympics, and then that would be the forcing mechanism to create the national railway system.
Well, isn't that what we're getting? Isn't that kind of what the next Olympics are going to be?
No, because it's just in LA, right?
We're getting the World Cup in 2026, though.
Oh, there you go. Okay, the World Cup is going to be all over the US and Canada and Mexico or something. I don't know. I can't even
What, really?
keep up with it.
Yeah, that's true. If Kamala Harris can just promise to build us a national high-speed rail system before 2026, I think she's a shoo-in.
So I just want to wrap this up by asking about budgets, because as you say, infrastructure always goes over budget. And one of the interesting things about the Brightline project in Florida is that it kind of didn't. And it was done kind of on budget and not massively expensively. And one of the ways they did that was just by running rail, across roads and putting like little arms that came down and saying like, it's a train. You stop for the train when the train comes along. And from a safety point of view, that turns out to have been a complete disaster. And literally hundreds of people have been killed by, ignoring signals and trying to beat the train and driving their car across the tracks. And there's almost nothing in the way of like suicide prevention and that kind of stuff. And I feel like a big federal train building project would be more expensive and also safer. And the Brightline project, because it was private sector, they're like, do we really need to spend a fortune on trying to persuade people not to kill themselves? And then people kill themselves.
It's true what you say that many people have been killed at grade crossings on the Brightline tracks, but I don't think it's because Brightline is private sector that it's been designed that way. I mean, the secret to Brightline's success, which is what makes it so hard to replicate, is they had an existing freight rail right-of-way that ran up the Atlantic coast of Florida. And so it wasn't that hard for them to say, we want to use this right of way to run all these trains. Obviously, the neighbors weren't happy about that because they were accustomed to having, one freight train full of oranges or something like that come through there once a day. And now they have 12 trains coming from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. But that's been the secret to their success, is having that existing right-of-way. And obviously that comes with grade crossings. That's part of the territory. Amtrak also has lots and lots of grade crossings across the country where its trains run, but those tend to be in less populated parts of the country, and the trains run less often, so it's less of an issue. But I do agree with you that grade crossings is not the way to run a high-speed rail system. And in fact, Brightline is not a high-speed rail system. High-speed rail has a technical definition, which is something like above 140 miles an hour, and Brightline trains don't go that fast, and indeed couldn't go that fast without a dedicated section of track. France can't run its TGV, or China its high-speed rail, or Japan its Shinkansen without dedicated track where you know that nothing is on the track or could be on the track, because the risk of an accident killing hundreds of people at that speed would just be far too great. So you go to Japan or something like that, they have electronic sensors on the tracks every mile of Shinkansen that will tell them if a tree has fallen across the track. And I'd be willing to bet that Brightline does not have that technology.
There was a great ProPublica investigation last year, the year before, about freight trains in the U.S., which are like miles long now. At least some of them are a mile or more long. And they take so long to cross the grades or to go through the crossings that people who live in these like rural areas, they're stuck. Some of them do wind up when the gates are down, they still go through if the freight train is stopped. And, you know, because they have to get to like work, or kids have to get to school. And I mean, it's a crazy situation.
And that's important, actually, because that illustrates a fact about America's non-high-speed rail network, Amtrak, which is that most of the tracks belong to freight rail companies, with the exception of the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak trains running from, say, New York to Chicago or Los Angeles to San Francisco are subject to whatever the freight rail company wants to do in front of them. And the freight rail companies are supposed to play nice, but if they have some giant train full of coal that needs to sit there for another couple hours, then your passenger train is going to be delayed. And I think ultimately there is a limit to what we can achieve in terms of high-speed rail or passenger rail at all, as long as we have these freight rail tracks that have all these grade crossings and have all these freight trains on them.
Okay, I think it's time for a numbers round. Emily, did you bring a number this week?
Yes, I did. I always bring a number, Felix. It's like the
that's because you're organized. Some of us just make it up as we go along, but you are organized. You always bring a number.
Okay, I had two options, but I'm going with this. Okay, my number is 30,000. That's the number of babies that were studied in 75 different clinical trials in literature reviews that looked at, and young parents who are listening will be with me on this one, sleep training, asking the question, is it harmful to babies? Anyone who's ever been a parent of a baby in the past, 20 years knows that sleep training is this very controversial thing. Basically, sleep training is just like letting the infant cry a little bit to learn how to put itself to sleep, and then saving parents like the worst life ever for the first year of the baby's life. And there is this like thriving ecosystem of sleep training haters on the internet and in the world. There's books, articles, Reddit posts, Instagrams. I mean, where people are like, if you sleep train your baby, you are effectively raising like a psychotic monster. You are doing irreparable damage and inflicting harsh trauma onto the baby. So it's very stressful. But you want to do it because you want to sleep. And it's really hard when you don't get any sleep. I'm telling you all this because there's this amazing data visualization on this site called The Pudding. I don't know if people know about it. And it's called Is Sleep Training Harmful? And the author, Tom, I'm afraid I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but it's Tom Vailant, makes a valiant effort to look at the research and conclude really what is the truth here. And he looks at all these studies, 75 clinical trials, 30,000 babies, and he finds it's not harmful. It's fine. None of the studies find it is harmful. It's totally fine. Parents, if you're listening, feel free to sleep train your babies. You will get a night's sleep. It'll be wonderful. We can share the link in the show notes. It's delightful.
Congratulations to everyone who got more sleep. I don't have any babies, but I am 100% in favor of sleep. More sleep, more better for everyone.
And debunking. We like debunking,
and debunkings.
Don't we?
We like debunkings too.
Yes.
My number is 0, which is the amount of federal income tax that medal-winning U.S. Olympians will pay on the money they get paid for winning medals in the Olympics. So this is the first thing I learned. Like this whole idea that the Olympics were all amateur, like that's gone out the window years ago. If you win a gold medal and you're an American, you get paid $37,500.
What?
$22,500 for silver and $15,000 for a bronze. And that money, you have to pay state and local income tax on it, but you do not need to pay federal income tax because I think Obama passed a law saying like, you know what, we're just going to not tax that because we're American and well done on winning medals. It's one of the few areas of tax-free income you can have.
Simone Biles cleaning up.
Oh, wait. One exception, though. If you make more than $1 million a year, then you have to pay tax on it. So like the basketball team, they all have to pay tax because they're all making more than $1 million a year. And I don't know how many endorsements Simone Biles has, but it could be that she has to pay tax.
She's probably paying tax, yeah.
Dang. It's okay. It sounds like they're doing great. But the state and local governments, come on, give them a break.
Oh, come on. You can't just like carve out income tax exceptions everywhere. That way, like,
isn't
chaos,
that the American
Emily.
way? That's what we do.
It's true. It's kind of our thing.
All right, Anna, what's your number?
So my number is 32 pounds and 22 pence.
Ooh, an English number. Is that
It is
an
an
amount
English number.
you've been paying?
It is an amount I've been paying. So I recently moved to London, and that is the amount I pay for both home internet and my cell phone. It's so low.
We've talked about this with Shira Overday more than once. American internet is so insanely expensive, and you move to any other country, and you're like, what?
Wait, so it's 32 pounds, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, there's just way more competition. It's delightful.
Were you shocked?
I was like, and the guy who at the store that I was signing up for could not believe it when I was telling him how much it cost in the U.S.
Wait till he hears about healthcare.
Yeah, it's true.
All right, Henry, bring us home. What's your number?
My number is 400,000, and that is the number of components that have gone into the scaffolding that supports all these temporary Parisian Olympics venues. Now, this is cool because, as we've discussed, their plan to build all these temporary venues has enabled them to decentralize these Olympics all over the city and build these venues in the heart of public spaces, etc. But the other cool thing is, when these venues come down after the Paralympics are over, these 400,000 pieces of scaffolding, upon which glorious medals were won, $37,000 prizes were awarded to American citizens, and so on, these will all be recycled into the French scaffolding ecosystem. Wow. And some facade painter in some suburb of Lyon will be up there fixing a crack and standing on the same scaffolding that once supported the stands from which people watched fencers or volleyball players or badminton players win their medals. So I think that's pretty cool.
It's the circle of life.
When they talk about recycling, I think this is a pretty cool example of reusing the stuff that the things that have gone into making these Olympics.
That is pretty awesome. Okay, I think that is it for the regular show. We are going to talk about soup dumplings in the Plus. Otherwise, for those of you who are foolish enough not to be Slate Plus members, thanks for listening. Thanks to Jared Downing and Jessamine Molli at Seaplane Armada for producing. And we will be back next week with even more Slate Money.